Driving down Highway 105, you can't help but notice the most distinctive feature in these Blue Ridge Mountains, the reclining profile of Grandfather Mountain. Join us as we profile the mountain before the McCraes and the Mortons got there. Grandfather Mountain, one of the oldest mountains in North America, is a place that's stirred the emotions of everyone that's ever gazed upon it. And that sense of awe is the common thread that connects us to those ancient Native Americans, indeed to all peoples, anyone who's ever stood witness to it. What is it about Grandfather that invites such a sense of awe? Is it the craggy profile, so unlike other southern mountaintops, or the dramatic vertical rise from the lowlands below? The flora, the fauna? It's probably a combination of all those things and more, depending on who you ask. But to really understand Grandfather, you've got to start with the geology, lending new meaning to the term, Grandfather rocks.
So the geology on Grandfather is pretty interesting. It's very complicated if you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. But in a nutshell, what happens here at Grandfather Mountain is about 300 million years ago, geologists believe that there was a collision between North America and Africa. And that collision created uplift, which pushed these mountain formations up into the air.
The geology is extremely complicated, even for anywhere. In Grandfather, it's extraordinary again because it happened in at least two different events. The mountain came up, and then another series of uplifts came up through the mountain. The rock was older, but it's actually on top, so it's overlaid even though it's older rock. So the complexities are kind of endless. There are different kinds of rock. They came up at different times, possibly hundreds of millions of years apart. Grandfather is almost certainly one of the oldest mountains in the Blue Ridge, maybe the oldest. It may be one of the oldest mountains in the world, but that's also where do you pick the spot where you say that's true? So that's a fascinating topic just in and of itself.
Another topic that frequently arises in relation to Grandfather Mountain centers on the subject of glaciers. Many people think its craggy profile had to have been carved by one of those northern glaciers that crept down south during the last ice age and covered it. Right? Well, that would make sense, wouldn't it? But not so fast.
The idea was that 10,000 BC or so, the glaciers came down to what had always been considered probably Pennsylvania, maybe as far south as Maryland, changed the ecology and everything of the south as well, because all the northern animals came down, waited for the ice to recede, and then went back up. In that process, some of them got fooled by the high mountains in the south and actually went up to the mountaintops, which mimicked habitat in Nova Scotia and many other places up north. So we get a lot of animals on Grandfather that really thought they were traveling up north. That's one cool part of the story. That's one thing that makes it really extraordinary in terms of its flora and fauna. So there was a scientist locally who, I'm not sure what probably the motivation was that it would have been a great discovery, thought that there was a chance that the glaciers had come all the way down to Grandfather. So he prowled around the mountain and he found these marks, vertical scratch marks, as if the ice had rolled the stones and the boulders and everything, scratched these scores in the rock, and then receded back up north. So he kept finding them. And so he wrote a paper saying it looked like irrefutable evidence that the glaciers had come 500-600 miles further south than anyone ever thought. And then a guy approached him who was an old logger, old timer. And he said, well, that's right there where we used to skid the logs. We had these big chains, and we ran those chains right over that rock to take these logs down off the mountain, and that's what those are. And that's what they were.
When gazing upon Grandfather, it's easy to imagine that it's always looked like it has today. The fact of the matter is that it's looked very different at different points in its history. If you were going to go back in time, say 150 years, you would have seen a mountain largely covered, especially the lower two-thirds of it, with a virgin chestnut tree forest. These were huge, towering trees that formed a thick canopy overhead, allowing very little sunlight to filter through. As a result, very little grew on the forest floor, creating an open and visible area. In fact, it's said that it was so open that a man riding a horse could pretty much go wherever he wanted through the forest. It's hard to imagine that happening today. With all the logging that occurred in the early part of the 20th century, the mountain, along with many other southern mountains, was completely timbered and subsequently transformed. New species moved in, including thick stands of rhododendron and mountain laurel, creating what today are known as hills. And there is no way a man on a horse could ride through one of those.
So if we were to go back about 20,000 years, that was kind of ending the Ice Age period. And then between, let's say, maybe 13 to 16,000 years ago, we had a whole bunch of conifers that were covering the landscape throughout southern Appalachia here. And then as the glaciers kind of retreated, the only place that the conifers could survive were at higher elevations, and you had deciduous trees that kind of moved in. But here at Grandfather Mountain, we have over 70 rare and endangered plants and animals, and a lot of those plants and animals that we have, the rare and endangers, are left over from that glacial period. So that's why the farther you travel up Grandfather Mountain, you're going to start to see that it starts to shift and look more like New England at higher elevations than it does like North Carolina.
With its steep elevation and numerous microclimates, Grandfather is also known for its amazing bounty of flowers, many of which grow virtually nowhere else in the world.
I love all the early spring flowers that we have here on the mountain. Trilliums are wonderful. I eat a lot of ramps, things like morels, which are mushrooms, which a lot of early settlers and people today still eat. This time of year, two of my favorite plants here on the mountain are Heller's Blazing Star and Blue Ridge Goldenrod. Those are two of our most endangered plants that we have here on the mountain. They only grow at the high elevation summits. Heller's Blazing Star is a small Liatris species, so it's a purple spear or purple spike of flowers, and it only grows at the high elevation rocky outcrops, which is it's marvelous, and it grows right there next to Blue Ridge Goldenrod. So you have this bright purple, purple flower right next to this yellow flower, which is absolutely beautiful. Catawba rhododendron is another, probably one of my favorites. The pink shell azalea, those are two high elevation species not found, in many places outside of southern Appalachia. Definitely the pink shell azalea.
Besides being the home for an amazing array of rare and beautiful flowers, Grandfather is the historical home for an astounding array of bird species. One of these, common among the high western peaks in the U.S., but much less common east of the Mississippi, is the raven.
Ravens are one of those birds that have just have a mythos about them. They were considered sacred and or demoniacal by different peoples. The medieval folks thought they were kingly birds. In fact, they were sometimes pets of kingly birds. Highly intelligent, highly adaptable. And what makes them interesting here is that the raven out west is very common. They're almost unknown in the east except on the high peaks.
And so it's hard to pick just one species here that would be my favorite, but it would probably be just the bird diversity in general here. We have over 200 species of birds that are seen here throughout the year, really about 260 species altogether that are seen here through migration and in the summer. We have over 70 nesting species here. And if I had to pick one, I would say probably the magnolia warbler, which is a beautiful little neotropical migrant. Spends its winter in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and then the summers here on Grandfather Mountain. What a better life, What two great places to spend your year.
Many of the animals that once inhabited Grandfather Mountain back in the Mesozoic era have died out, including such megafauna as the giant ground sloth. One Mesozoic era animal that survives up until today is the black bear. Why or how did they survive? Well, bears eat most anything, will travel up to 15 miles a day. They can run, fight, climb, dig, and swim in equal measure. And they reduce their vital signs to near comatose levels and sleep off the hardest part of winter, which sounds like a pretty good strategy to me.
Well, one animal that's been extremely successful everywhere, including on Grandfather, is our bear, the brown bear, black bear. And he has been around since prehistoric times, and they are survived through their adaptability, which is what basically is Darwin's key to survival for all species, and they have it in spades. They can fish, they can hunt, they can eat anything, they can be carnivorous, they can be vegetarian, they can hibernate when there's nothing to eat, and they can survive the harshest winter, they can survive the steepest mountain, they can survive anywhere. basically on every continent. So in some place like Grandfather, which offers a huge range of habitats, they're going to find some place they like.
While Grandfather is well known for its birds and animals, did you also know that it's famous for its salamanders? Seriously. People travel from all over the world to study the 21 confirmed species of salamanders that have been found there. 3 of these, the Yanalasi, the northern shovel-nosed salamander, and the Weller salamander, are thought to live nowhere else.
Definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about are salamanders, especially the Weller salamander. Here on Grandfather Mountain, I mentioned earlier, we have an incredible amount of rare and endangered plants and animals here on the mountain. The Weller salamander is one that is specially adapted to live here on the mountain, so is only going to be found in high elevation spruce fir forests here in southern Appalachia, and was discovered by the early herpetologist Worth Hamilton Weller.
So Worth he came out actually looking for his own species, which was something every scientist wants. You get to name it after yourself or your daughter, whatever you want to do. And this one he was looking for, most of the salamanders are thought to be down in the river bottoms, in the lower elevations. And he had some indication, and I'm not sure what it was, that he would find a new salamander at the top. So he went up, and the location is not exact, but I believe it was near the crystal mine, to probably over 5,000 feet, and just started turning over rocks. And by Jove, he found it. As a little guy that had never been seen before, and he got 3 or 4 specimens and brought them back, took them to Cincinnati, confirmed, named them after himself, the Welleri, Salamanders Welleri, whatever it was. And he went back to Grandfather because at that point he was going to find another, either more of the same or another species. He went back up toward the summit, and on a big rock outcropping, he slipped on a wet rock and fell to his death at the age of 20-something.
The tragic tale of Worth Weller makes you realize that the mountain has been an important destination for many different visitors for a very long period of time. While we'll never know who the very first prehistoric visitors to the mountain were, there's no doubt that they came thousands of years before the first Europeans ever saw it. And it makes you wonder if, upon seeing the mountain for the first time, did those folks feel the same sort of feelings that the mountain stirs in us today?
There could be no doubt that Grandfather Mountain, because of its uniqueness, played some special role and had some special significance to any native society that ever witnessed the thing. We haven't discovered what that is yet through archaeology. One problem is that some of the larger caves up there have already been completely routed out. You know, Indian House Cave, well, why is it called that? What used to be in there? I think that hopefully my student who's working on this might come across some documentation or maybe even find somebody to talk to, an eyewitness who can say, yes, you know, I know what came out of there because I saw it, but I'm not aware of that person's existence right now.
So, who then were the first Native Americans to visit Grandfather Mountain? Was it the Cherokee, the Catawba, other tribes living on the Yadkin River Valley like the Tutelo and Saponi? The answer is definitely no. The evidence points to natives that lived much further back in time than either the Cherokee or the Catawba.
We think that the first visitors were, of course, Native Americans, probably in the very end of the Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago. We find occasionally a spear point that's of a style that indicates activity at that time period, but we have to be very careful about that because sometimes things like that were picked up by later people and carried along and used and dropped. So just because it might have been made 12,000 years ago doesn't mean it was brought here 12,000 years ago. But there are enough of them found in the high country here, in and around Grandfather Mountain, to indicate at least people passing through the mountains, maybe seasonally, at the end of the Ice Age. About 10,000 years ago, we see, maybe it's a false indication, but it seems like an influx of people seasonally migrating into the mountains still. Hunters and gatherers coming here on a seasonal basis to avail themselves of the nut crops, the fat deer in the fall, the turkeys, and perhaps medicines and stone resources that they needed to And then at 900 AD, that's the beginning of a global warming period called the medieval warm, when temperatures were just slightly higher on the average than they were otherwise prior. And so that's when we see the first villages. These were not migratory hunters and gatherers. They were agriculturalists growing primarily maize. And that is when, at the higher elevations, they could have gotten a successful harvest.
With what was called the medieval warm, life in the high country became a little easier. Winters saw less snow and summers lasted longer, which meant extended growing seasons. But before you get too excited about the prospect of mild winters and long summers, hang on. As so often happens with our natural environment, things were about to change.
Yeah, and then in about 1300 AD, the medieval warm came to an end, and we had what was called the Little Ice Age. I mean, it wasn't an ice age, but they nicknamed it that because it was a slight cooling trend, and it affected societies all over Europe. It's well documented that people were starving, and farmers in the highlands of northern Europe had to move to lower elevations, and it affected the Indians of this region too, because the villages disappear at about 1300 AD from the really high elevations, like the Valley Crucis area and around Grandfather Mountain. There were no villages after 1300.
Even though evidence of their permanent villages disappear after 1300 AD, there is no doubt that the Native Americans continue to seasonally visit the slopes and rock shelters of Grandfather Mountain, hunting deer, bear, and turkey, and they also certainly foraged for some of the 500 plant species they used in the area for food, medicine, dyes, and special ceremonies. And there's also evidence that they collected the quartz crystals that are so prevalent on the mountain as well. Much like the Indians who came as seasonal visitors, the first white men who visited Grandfather Mountain were most likely hunters and trappers and explorers. One of the first was good old Daniel Boone. Besides being a local legend, Boone was actually a pretty fascinating guy. He might have been a backwoods frontiersman, but he was not backward. Sitting around the campfire at night, he might bring out a book, begin reading aloud. The two books he carried were the Bible and Gulliver's Travels. My favorite quote attributed to Boone was, "I've never been lost, but once I was bewildered for 3 days."
Well, Boone was an interesting person, much more so than his Hollywood persona. He actually did live on the mountain. He came up from kind of the Lenoir area where he lived with his wife and family, and he hunted and he fished, but he had a succession of cabins, at least 2 on the mountain, and possibly more, where he lived for much of the year. He was almost indistinguishable from a Native American in the way he dressed. He had companions who were Melungeon and who were Native Americans. He was highly literate. He was a Quaker and a pacifist, and an absolutely fascinating man altogether. And so when he moved on, which he did because when there was more than 3 people around, he got very nervous, and he kept on going, until he got to a settlement in Kentucky, which filled with people. And at that point, there really wasn't too many more places he could go. He was a terrible businessman. He was a terrible politician. He tried all of those things, but he was a great frontiersman. And he was a great person. He was really he had very little impact. He did not kill Indians. He did not kill animals wantonly. He hunted as he needed to, and all that's well documented. So he was a great person to have on Grandfather, and he was possibly its earliest white resident right on the mountain. Like Charles Linville and the rest of them lived along the Linville River, which is on the mountain but off its shoulder. Boone's cabins were up there. He lived on the mountain, and sometimes even during the winter. So he was a serious frontier guy.
Following the arrival of Boone, a slow trickle of settlers started coming up the mountain and settling around Grandfather. Its reputation as a special and unique place began to spread far and wide. It began attracting the attention of some of the most famous naturalists of the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of them decided to make the long and difficult journey to see what all the buzz was about, and they were not to be disappointed.
There was a number of great naturalists that came to Grandfather Mountain. Bartram, Catesby, a number of others, but really the first one that we have a lot of information on was André Michaux, and he came here in 1794, and he was a French botanist who was actually brought here to collect botanical specimens for the Royal Gardens in France. And he was encountering specimens he had never seen before and were new to science. Collected from, really he started his trip in Charlotte and made it all the way to Grandfather Mountain in that trip. And found specimens that weren't identified at the time. One in particular, a Coney Bells, actually brought another great botanist to the area, Asa Gray. Asa Gray visited in 1841 and was actually in search of a plant that he had seen in Michaud's specimen collection, a Coney Bells, and he didn't find it on Grandfather, but the record showed that Grandfather Mountain was where that plant was collected. Lo and behold, that was from some of the lower valleys down the escarpment off the Blue Ridge Mountains, and was later discovered in the late 1800s by a gentleman from Statesville. And he sent the specimen to Gray at Harvard, and of course Gray was just ecstatic. So it's known as the plant lost for 100 years.
Another famous naturalist that visited Grandfather around the same time as Michaud was John Fraser. Fraser was a Scottish botanist who was credited with introducing over 200 distinct plant species from the Americas to Europe. He's also known locally as the namesake of the Cadillac of Christmas trees, the Fraser fir, which once covered the crown of Grandfather Mountain. Unfortunately, however, he and Michaud were not the best of friends.
So there was a very philosophical difference between John Fraser and Andre Michaud. Fraser was more of a commercial collector. So he was collecting specimens to take back to grow in nurseries and greenhouses, basically to make a profit. And Michaud was collecting them for the rural gardens. He was much more focused on collecting specimens that were beautiful, that were unique. And the two of them really did not like each other. They were here about the same time, had some interactions, and somewhat of a competition too, because they were both taking these specimens back to Europe, and they were both getting reputations for being the botanist in the New World. And so there was definitely some competition there between the two. They were visiting similar places and seeing similar things. Plants that one might overlook, the other one made famous, and vice versa. And so this happened for a number of years, but there was definitely some controversy between John Fraser and Andre Michaud.
The late 1700s and early 1800s was an interesting time in the history of Grandfather Mountain. On the one hand, you had some of the greatest scientific minds in the world visiting the high country to learn more about Grandfather's flora and fauna. On the other hand, according to local legend, you had a piece of property, the mountain itself, that nobody was really excited to own. Or were they?
One of the interesting things I've come across recently is how it was all the different land grants. I mean, this little piece here and these 200 acres there and these 300 or 400 acres there. One of the local stories is that, and this is not, as my research has now proven, was not all entirely true. Nobody wanted Grandfather Mountain, which is hard for us to believe today. It's now, you have the attraction side and you have the state park side. And it's a beautiful place, and it generates revenue and provides jobs and everything into the local economy, good for the local economy. But nobody wanted it, because as far as if you're a farmer, subsistence farming, it's worthless ground. So one of the interesting things that I've come across in the past few weeks, I've sat down and I went through and looked at all the different land grants. It's one of the very first was Waitsgill Avery, who Avery County was named for. He got a lot of the property from the top of Grandfather on down over Grandmother Mountain. That was a land grant that he got. Now, as we get on into the 1850s and the 1860s, the Lenoir family out of Caldwell County has purchased or acquired a lot of the property that we now know as Grandfather Mountain. And that property goes down to Walter Lenoir, and he is the person who owns it up until the McRae family and the Kelsey family start to acquire it on into 1880s, 1890s.
Around the beginning of the 20th century, access to the mountain became easier with the development of area roads. And as our country grew more wealthy, people were traveling more than ever before. And many of them, particularly during the hot, flatland summers, wanted to experience the wonder and coolness of Grandfather Mountain.
The first road on Grandfather was the toll road up to the resort, where they were able to bring people up onto the mountain simply because it was a better road than anywhere else, and so they also charged a fee to do so. So that was the early resort road, the Linville Toll Road, and as people came, and it was suddenly obvious that just the exploding populations on the East Coast were going to come, and that the possibilities for them to come basically to enjoy the area part-time were already pretty clear in the late 1800s. And so that's exactly what happened. And the road building was key to, as it really was everywhere in the U.S., key to the population coming in large amounts. It also gave them the opportunity to leave before the winter, which was equally important, because no one was going to come get stuck up here or be taken, rely on Daniel Boone. It had to be, to have the flow back and forth required the roads, and that came in the late 1800s, and then it exploded in the 1920s.
With the advent of roads and the Tweetsie Railroad, Grandfather Mountain saw more human activity than it ever had in its previous history. And this was not necessarily a good thing. An outfit called the Linville Improvement Company acquired much of the mountain and promptly began cutting all of its virgin timber. In fact, the area around the base of the mountain became a sea of stumps, and known to locals as Stumptown. But the power of the forest to revive and resuscitate itself, given half a chance in a little time, is absolutely amazing. I want you to think about it. Less than 100 years ago, in the Linville area at the base of the mountain, it was known as Stumptown. Today, vibrant forests cover the slopes of the mountain, and many species, including the bear and falcons, have been successfully reintroduced onto the mountain.
So Grandfather Mountain, it's undergone a lot of changes over the years. It was, we had Native Americans thriving here for thousands of years. We had early botanists and explorers coming here to learn all the botanical specimens and the flora and fauna that existed here. We had a generation of the McCraes and Samuel T. Kelsey that really started a development here and human existence, Europeans living here full time. And then we had the transition into a nature park with Hugh Morton from 1952 until 2006 when he passed away. And so we're at a present state where we're really looking into the future of Grandfather Mountain. And the future looks really bright.
The preservation of the flora and fauna has brought scientists from all over the world. It has also brought ecotourists from all over the world. And river people, there are native trout still, I hope, in the upper reaches of the Watauga River. And it goes on and on and on like that. Much of the key to why it is a successful tourist attraction is that it is a preserved tourist attraction.